Okay, people, the first video from this new channel, I wanted to read from chapter 1 of a book called The Great Betrayal, the General Welfare Clause of the Constitution by Eustace Mullins. This book is very relevant with what's happening today. Chapter 1, Jefferson and or Hamilton. During the past 50 years, I have found a recurring leitmotif throughout the evidence which I have amassed detailing subterranean influences which have been working to wreck our nation. This leitmotif is to be found again and again in the history of the American people. It is the record of the opposition of the ideals of two men, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, who epitomized throughout their political careers two divergent strains of thought. The irreconcilable and still unresolved conflict between those who believe in the people of the United States, as did Thomas Jefferson, and those who believe only in the unrestrained machinations of a hidden oligarchy, as did Alexander Hamilton. In my first published work, Mullins on the Federal Reserve, I discussed the opposing forces which these two men represented throughout their lives, and the influence of those forces upon the subsequent history of this nation. Those unresolved conflicts were present and became apparent during the actual writing of the Constitution in Philadelphia in 1787. Article 1, Section 8 treats many of the points on which Jefferson and Hamilton remained in contention, one of the most important being the provision that, quote, "the Congress shall have power to coin money, regulate the value thereof and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures," unquote. This crucial matter soon became one which was brought out into the open after the adoption of the Constitution by the states, when Alexander Hamilton sought a government charter for a new central bank, the Bank of the United States. Thomas Jefferson, in a brilliant disquisition, published the principal and most cohesive arguments against the granting of the charter. Jefferson's expose failed to discourage the powerful influences from Europe, which were determined to foist their central bank on the people of the United States, and the charter was granted. However, it subsequently was not renewed, a denial which resulted in the War of 1812, as the European bankers sought to force the American people to accept their foreign creature as a native creation. A second Bank of the United States was then chartered under the auspices of Nicholas Biddle of Philadelphia, who was acting as the agent for the Rothschilds of Europe. This second bank also met its Waterloo in the presence of Andrew Jackson, a fiery patriot who swore to destroy the bank. He refused to renew its charter, which brought quick retaliation from the bankers of Europe, a financial crisis which became known as the Panic of 1837. The struggle between the forces represented by Alexander Hamilton and those represented by Thomas Jefferson thus seesawed back and forth throughout the 19th century, with first one side and then the other gaining a temporary advantage. However, the proponents of the Hamiltonian monetary system gained momentum with the creation of giant corporations just after the Civil War, and with these resources they stage managed another financial panic, the Panic of 1907, which stampeded the American people into calling for a central bank, which was to be misleadingly titled the Federal Reserve System. In 1948, the poet Ezra Pound, who was then being held as a political prisoner by the government of the United States, introduced me to the machinations of the Federal Reserve central bankers. I have since devoted almost half a century to chronicling its activities, with the ultimate goal that once the people had this documented information, they could then begin to take remedial action through the powers enshrined in the Constitution. However, while I was occupied with this seemingly unending task, I failed to realize that the bankers themselves were aware that the Babylonian monetary system, which they had enshrined in their creation of an American central bank, could not go undetected forever, and that they had prudently devised a second Hamiltonian strategy, one which also had been covered in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. This strategy promised to bring the conspirators even greater power and greater profits than the Federal Reserve System itself. This new strategy was based upon the provisions of the Constitution, which are to be found first in the preamble, that Congress shall have power to provide for the common defense and the general welfare of the United States, and repeated in Article 1, Section 8, Congress shall have power to provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. The language of this provision is crucial. For some 50 years, there has been a general understanding among the American people that the Constitution makes provision for the, quote, the general welfare of the people of the United States, unquote. However, there has never been any such language in the Constitution. Quote, the general welfare of the United States, unquote, means the preservation of the compact of the states, which was expressly drawn up by the Constitution. The welfare of the people of the United States was, according to that language, and is still, the province reserved to the individual states. Each American citizen is a citizen of a state of the United States. That state is a signer of the compact of the states, which is the Constitution, and which forms the United States of America. There is no provision for, quote, the United States, unquote, to take direct action concerning any citizen of the United States, because the United States has no people and no citizens. Only the states have citizens. Nevertheless, the opportunity for misinterpretation and misunderstanding provided by this provision of the Constitution, which has become known as, quote, the General Welfare Clause, unquote, gave the conspirators with the vehicle by which they have gradually, during the past 60 years, replaced the compact of the states with a new creation, the welfare state. The welfare state is a device which has been erected upon the premise that the government should take responsibility for the individual well-being of each and every citizen of the United States, usurping this function from the states in order to create a totalitarian corporate state which now presumes, from its Washington fortress, to direct the most minute daily activities of each of our citizens. Not only has there never been any legal basis for any of these interventions, but the language of the Constitution and the far-sighted provisions inserted by the Founding Fathers expressly sought to forbid and prevent any such development at any time in our subsequent history. It is this welfare state which is confidently predicted to ultimately replace the control of our nation by the machinations of the Federal Reserve System, with an even greater and more iron-fisted control, that of the welfare state. This present gigantic edifice is nothing less than a modern Tower of Babel, greater and more awe-inspiring than the original, but one which was built upon identical goals and aspirations of those who seek to control every act of every American forever. How were the conspirators able to visit such a calamity upon our nation? As usual, they set the stage with their scenery and plot, which was designed to make such a denouement inevitable. Their vehicle was the stock market crash of Black Friday in 1929, followed by the Great Depression, an economic disaster which could have easily been remedied in a few months, but which the conspirators, ably assisted by their stage manager, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, managed to prolong from 1931 until Pearl Harbor in 1941. During this period, the Federal Reserve System, in concert with the central banks of Europe, kept the Hamiltonian methods of monetary management in operation, and effectively prevented any economic recovery from taking place in this nation. How was this done? It was done by the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, who exercised daily control over the price of money and the quantity of money. By manipulating the interest rate, that is, the price of money, they controlled bank loans and the interest which those Americans who still had savings could receive for their investments. They controlled the quantity of money by the operations of the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee, which daily bought or sold on the open market many millions of dollars worth of government bonds, which themselves were created from nothing, more bookkeeping entries on the ledgers of the Federal Reserve System. By deliberately keeping the American people in the thrall of the Great Depression and unable to benefit from any economic recovery, the conspirators not only maintained their monetary profits and their political power, they also delivered the American people into the hands of their new vehicle of national and eternal slavery, the welfare state. At no time was the new welfare state ever advertised as such. Instead, it was promoted by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in his quavering, high-pitched voice, a delivery which was popularly supposed to be that of the old aristocracy, as the New Deal. In his fireside chats, radio speeches, which went directly into every American home, Roosevelt assured the people that they were indeed to become the beneficiaries of his New Deal. They soon found out what the New Deal was. From the outset, it was the iron fist hidden in a velvet glove. The New Deal did indeed promise and deliver handouts of one kind or another, surplus food, which instead of being destroyed in deliberate maneuvers by the commodities brokers to keep up prices and increase their profits, was in some instances actually delivered to needy families. Jobs were also created by the government, but in every instance such jobs were, quote, make work, unquote, non-productive work, which deliberately was invented to ensure that there would be no competition with the profit-making enterprises of the conspirators. One of these efforts, the Civilian Conservation Corps, was modeled after the Hitler Youth of Nazi Germany and the Fascist Corps of Mussolini's Germany. In fact, much of the New Deal, as one of its principal promoters, Gerard Swope, proudly pointed out, had been taken directly from the principles of the corporate state which had been set up in Italy. The New Deal rapidly became the new corporate state, erected upon the ashes of the Constitution. To institute its totalitarian decrees, a ragtail group of demagogues and traitors now descended upon Washington. Many of them were active espionage agents of the World Communist Party. Others were fascist. Still others were well-groomed and personable agents of the international bankers, who had been educated at the most expensive schools, clothed by the most expensive tailors, and polished in the tenets of international society. In fact, many of the New Deal agents incorporated in their presence more than one, and sometimes all three, of the aforementioned categories. They found no incongruity in living off the proceeds of the investments or trust funds, engaging in the most surreptitious conspiracies of a world revolution, and at the same time joining or dropping out of such entities as the Communist Party or the Fascist Party. Typical of these New Dealers was a lanky, well-spoken technocrat named Alger Hiss. He would later become the personal confidant of President Roosevelt at the White House, and still later he would be chosen as president of the highly respected foundation, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, by Republican leaders Dwight D. Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles. The leader of the New Deal task forces was himself a remarkable man who, like his predecessor Woodrow Wilson, had been the personal protege of the international wheeler and dealer Colonel Edward Mandell House. Franklin Delano Roosevelt grew up with the traditional silver spoon in his mouth, the spoon being provided through the enterprise of his grandfather, Warren Delano, who had become the most prominent opium dealer in Hong Kong. Although his grandson never personally participated in the world drug trade, he never turned his back on anyone who was so engaged, nor did he ever complain of any taint on the money which provided him with his opulent lifestyle. Roosevelt himself rarely participated in the espionage activities on behalf of Soviet Russia and the World Communist Party, which had now became centered in New Deal Washington. Such responsibilities were turned over to his associates such as Alger Hiss and Bela Moskowitz. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president, the unseen architect of this accomplishment, Bela Moskowitz, remained in the background. She had achieved the seemingly miraculous transformation of a helpless cripple in a wheelchair, an amiable aristocrat who had never worked a day in his life, but had always lived off the dope proceeds left by his grandfather, into a vigorous, ambitious, and personable national politician who was subsequently to be transformed even more miraculously into the leader of the, quote, free world, unquote, during the approaching Second World War. Before Roosevelt's inauguration, Bela Moskowitz was robbed of her moment of triumph when she fell down the stairs. Whether this was one of those accidents to which such conspirators are prone was never investigated. However, she was promptly replaced as the head of the Washington espionage group by an even more devious and disreputable revolutionary, a Viennese immigrant named Felix Frankfurter. Frankfurter, who now took up his duties in Washington as a secret head of the ubiquitous communist espionage group known as the Harold Ware Cell, had been denounced by his mentor's own cousin, former President Theodore Roosevelt, as the most dangerous communist in America. Throughout the 1930s, Frankfurter staffed the agencies of the new welfare state with his own protégés, who were known as, quote, the little weenies, unquote, or, quote, the happy hot dogs, unquote. These bureaucrats, one and all, were first under the discipline of the World Communist Party, second, dedicated to the erection of the new welfare state, and third, sworn to the destruction and dissolution of the Constitution of the United States and the ending of all the safeguards which the Founding Fathers had inculcated in that document to preserve the individual liberties of each and every citizen of the United States. The immediate result was that any American who was contacted by one of these agents quickly learned that he was now dealing with a bureaucrat who refused to acknowledge that any American could still benefit from individual rights. Instead, the bureaucrats of the new welfare state delivered decrees. Anyone who failed to obey them fully would become a victim of force. The full powers of federal, state, and local police, the courts, and even the National Guard would be called into play to enforce any and every decree of the welfare state. Of course, this was merely the first incarnation of what our present politicians fondly refer to as, quote, the New World Order, unquote. They are very bashful about describing this new entity, but on the rare occasions when they do reveal some titillating aspect of its existence, they are quick to remind us that it is always based upon force. The New World Order does not intend to pamper any American citizen who refuses to abide by its dictatorial decrees. Okay, that was chapter 1 from The Great Betrayal by Eustace Mullins. It's a short book, it's only 37 pages, 6 short chapters. Remember, don't believe anything that's in this book until you research it yourself. And feel free to comment, to discuss it in the comments of what you find. And we'll be back with another video. Thanks.